Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Danielle Kessler, and I am the U.S. Director of the International Fund for Animal Welfare. We're a global organization. We work in more than 40 countries around the globe, and we have a range of activities that we work on, and one of those being wildlife trafficking. So an issue that I've been working on for more than a decade, and one that is near and dear to my heart for us to learn more about how to combat illegal wildlife trade. I'm joined today with three esteemed panelists that I have a great pleasure to speak with today about illegal wildlife trade, and in particular, some of the perhaps untapped sources of information that we might be able to use to help us in combating that illegal trade. So just a couple of setting background for folks a bit. Illegal wildlife trade is a major transnational organized crime. It generates billions of criminal proceeds each year. It fuels corruption, it threatens biodiversity, and it can have a significant negative impact on public health and the economy. It is one of the largest illicit trades globally and estimated to be worth between 5 to 23 billion per year. The 2020 UNODC World Wildlife Crime Report provides some clear evidence of the globalized nature of this trade. According to its data, nearly 6,000 species were seized between 1999 to 2019, including not only mammals, but reptiles, corals, birds, and fish. It also shows that no single species is responsible for more than 5% of the seizures. No single country was identified as the source of more than 9% of the total number of seized shipments, and that suspected traffickers of some 150 nationalities have been identified. Illegal wildlife trade is truly a global issue and one that needs global solutions. So I'm very pleased to be joined here today with some folks with different perspectives, different backgrounds that can help to shed some light onto illegal wildlife trade, what's driving it, and some of the ways that we can combat it. So in no particular order, first I am joined here today by Andrea Costa. Andrea, sorry, can we edit that one out?
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Andrea is the executive director and board member of Earthling International. He has over 30 years of experience in conservation projects around the world and has been working for over 17 years as an international consultant to companies and governmental agencies on high-end security technologies and services, homeland security, anti-piracy, investigations, and risk management. He now applies this unique knowledge to conservation and wildlife protection. He's also among the founding members of the Wildlife Justice Commission, a member of the board of the African Conservancy Foundation, and the creator and project manager of Wild Leaks, the world's first wildlife crime whistleblower initiative. Andrea also has a number of publications and documentaries to his credit that have explored the depths of illegal wildlife trade and helped elevate this issue to mainstream audiences. Next on our panelist is Dan Ashe, president and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. A lifelong animal conservationist, Dan joined AZA in January 2017 after serving as the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for nearly 6 years, successfully leading the agency and its thousands of employees during a period of significant challenges. Following a 13-year career as a professional staff member of the former Committee on Merchant Marine and Fisheries in the U.S. House of Representatives, Dan held positions of increasing responsibility at the service, including Assistant Director for External Affairs, Chief of the National Wildlife Refuge System, and Science Advisor to the Director and Deputy Director. And finally, rounding out our panelists today is Dr. Tanya Wyatt, Professor of Criminology at Northumbria University. Dr. Wyatt is a professor of criminology specializing in green criminology. Her expertise centers on wildlife crime and trafficking, non-human animal abuse and welfare, and the intersections of organized crime, corporate crime, and corruption. Other research interests are crimes of the powerful, particularly industrial agriculture and pollution. Thank you all for being here with us today. And so with that, let me turn over to Andrea for a few remarks.
Yes, very happy to be here. At Earthling International, we not only focus on wildlife crime, environmental crime, we deal with information of all kinds, and we get this information from all kinds of sources. On the one hand, we have undercover teams on the ground. Their task is to research the illegal supply chain with a top-down, bottom-up approach. To identify the most important players. We are interested only in those people, and then we engage them up close and personal for many, many months, sometimes years, in order to extract all kind of information from those people who are, in our opinion, the most important wildlife traffickers in the world. On the other hand, we also launched in 2014 Wild Leaks, the world's first whistleblowing initiative dedicated to environmental crime, because spending so much time in the field, we realized that there's a lot of people with a lot of information, but for various reasons, they just don't share it. They don't know where to share, or sometimes it's difficult, if not dangerous, where they live to share information. You don't just go to the police and report serious wildlife crime. So we thought to launch Wild Leaks to facilitate, to create a safe space where people can submit information anonymously and securely. And I have to say it worked very well, and it's still, in my opinion, like a tool with a lot of potential in the future. But certainly, through Wild Leaks, we realize the incredible, so many people know so much about environmental crime, but they just don't share it, and so it's that's why it is very important to focus more on whistleblowing and the role of whistleblowing, because in my opinion, like they helped with other kind of crimes in the past, they might be, they can play an important role also in fighting environmental crime and wildlife crime.
Great, thank you. Absolutely agree with all of that, Andrea. There's so much information out there, and we just need to sometimes find ways to get it into the hands of those that can really put it into use. All right, over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Danielle. It's great to be here with this panel and celebrating Whistleblower Day. But to begin, I'll confess that during a 35-year career in US federal government, including nearly 6 as the Senate confirmed director of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, that hearing the term whistleblower fell somewhere on a spectrum between a very poorly played violin and a screeching dentist's drill. So I think that's an important issue for this community to recognize and address as we endeavor to better ingrain and incorporate whistleblowing and whistleblower protections into mainstream enforcement of laws and regulations addressing wildlife crime. And of course, wildlife crime is pandemic. There is no vaccine. The only prevention is in collective human concern and restraint. So the equivalent of collaborative social distancing and masking in preventing COVID-19, and we saw how well that worked. The victims in this pandemic are not human, although some are iconic and sympathetic, like elephants and rhinos. Most are the less privileged of the wildlife world, and therefore process, law and regulation, effective implementation, aggressive and sustained enforcement, and successful prosecution are the necessary ingredients to ending this pandemic. And we're going to need every tool in our toolbox, and whistleblowing and whistleblower protection is and will be an increasingly important tool. We need to find and attack those who are profiting from illegal wildlife trade. Whistleblowers can be a key resource with access to the information that can fuel enforcement and prosecution. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums is supporting the End Wildlife Crime Initiative with 2 key objectives: achieving a 5th protocol to the International Treaty on Organized Crime, or UNCTAD, addressing wildlife crime, and amending the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, to refashion it as a global One Health framework addressing the effects of wildlife trade on both species and human health. Incorporating whistleblower protection and reward in all of these efforts will enrich all of them and help us end this pandemic of wildlife crime. I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Dan. And yeah, you bring us some really good points there about whistleblower protections, and perhaps we'll delve a bit deeper on that and how we might be able to do more to enhance those. All right, Tanya, over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you again for the invitation to this great event for National Whistleblowers Day. As Danielle mentioned, I'm a professor of criminology at Northumbria University, which is in Newcastle in the United Kingdom. But I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer where I spent 2 years in Ukraine working on anti-human trafficking programs. And before that, I was actually a deputy sheriff and police officer in different parts of the US. But now I'm a green criminologist, and green criminology is a subfield of what I think is a highly misunderstood discipline. So when people think of criminology, they typically think that we're all CSI or out of crime scenes or something. And we're actually really critical social scientists, part of a really radical discipline that's trying to challenge what crime is actually defined as. And green criminology since the late 1990s has been investigating the causes, consequences, and victims of environmental crimes and harms. And that includes an expanded view of who can be a victim, where we look at non-human animals and plants and the environment as being victims as well. And I've been specializing in wildlife trafficking since 2005. I've done fieldwork in Moscow and Far East Russia around fur and falcons, and then been parts of research in about 12 other countries. My most recent piece of research I just finished was about CITES that Dan just mentioned and how it's implemented and assessing compliance for that. I'm part of 3 projects, though. I'm just an advisor on these that I think are relevant to issues around whistleblowing. So one of these is the Wildlife Trade Futures, which is funded by the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund. And that's looking at this interface between COVID and wildlife trade and how wildlife trade in lower middle income countries in particular might be changed or because of the policy changes that are taking place based out of the coronavirus pandemic. The second project I am an advisor on is the USAID funded Targeting Natural Resource Corruption, which is led by the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center out of Bergen, Norway, and WWF there in the US. And I think we can't really talk about whistleblowing without talking about corruption. So there's clearly some overlap there. And then finally, an exciting new project that just kicked off here in Europe called Beastly Business, headed by Professor Rosaline Duffy. And that's looking at the trafficking of bears, eels, and songbirds just in Europe, which I think is a great initiative, since often Europe and the US really get overlooked when we're talking about wildlife trafficking. And so all of this research and advisory that I've done, I've looked at who it is that is doing the trafficking. And so that's individuals, organized crime groups, corporate crime groups. And so that's given me a really solid understanding of where I think we can put in interventions targeted at allowing and opening up whistleblowing to actually take place. But I think we'll talk more about that as the panel goes on.
Great, thank you, Tanya. I'm very interested to hear the insights from those recent projects that you're working on. And as you said, that the US and EU is often overlooked, but as we know, this is such a global problem. US and EU are often, they're often thought of, I think, as the source or the demand countries, but they are a source and transit point as well. So look forward to discussing more on that. Great, so I wanted to start at sort of some basics to start laying the groundwork for some of our audiences who might be watching today that are coming into this issue because they were interested in whistleblowing that is perhaps related to other forms of trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, frankly, forms of crime that are often sort of prioritized as being more serious than wildlife trafficking. And so just want to take a moment to first, why is this such a serious issue? And why is it an issue that particularly relative to these other crimes that we should all care about?
all my information come from our work in the field. We, as an organization, we are sort of fact finders, meaning we go in places and in situations where maybe other NGOs or other groups prefer not to go, which is right in the middle of trafficking, meaning interacting with who we believe are the most important traffickers in the world. And to explain you better what I'm saying and what we're doing, what we found, I can use the example of Latin America. We have been working in Latin America for the past 3 years and a half, and during this period of time, we identify and engage directly more than 25 trafficking networks. They interact with each other regionally and then globally, and for a total of over 250 persons of interest targets, all of them pretty high up in the chain, as we are not interested in the work at poaching level. And I can tell you that of those 250 people, more than half are heavily involved in other crimes, mostly human smuggling and money laundering. The money laundering is particularly serious because during the years, those traffickers probably, while the war was focused mostly on poachers and anti-poaching, those traffickers thrived and became not only very powerful, but also very good in what they're doing. And so they are so good in laundering money for themselves that they started to launder money for others, very often for powerful and dangerous local criminal organizations. Last week, we engaged a target in Latin America, and this guy, wildlife trafficker, and he told our team that on the side, he laundered between $3 and $4 million a week for others. So this is why we should all care, because it's not just about animals. It's not just about the traffickers of nature, as I call them, is about allowing very dangerous people, very dangerous group that are dangerous for other people, not only for biodiversity and nature. We allow them to thrive and to grow and to become more and more important. So this is why we should, and this is called convergence. So we work a lot on the convergence with environmental crime, with other kind of crimes. So it's time to take this thing seriously. It's time to also, in my opinion, and this is pretty much, this is an important part of my work also from a communication and advocacy point of view. It's time to update the current narrative, which in my opinion is a bit obsolete and certainly incomplete, and shift the attention from the poachers to the traffickers. It's in my opinion crucial if we want to start working in a different way. And what they mentioned before about whistleblowing, and also the being able to protect whistleblowing, because otherwise, if you don't protect them, you will not have any whistleblower. I have an example. 4 years ago, we were approached through WideLeaks, through our whistleblowing platform, and then personally via email. I got approached by a prominent African politician, former former minister of a country. And he knew a lot about ivory trafficking. And I'm talking about, the information coming from the elephant poaching crisis. So when we were seeing hundreds of tons of ivory leaving Africa every year. And he was willing to give to give a lot of information, but I don't know, in his mind, I think he saw a few films. So he asked for witness protection. And I was trying to explain that there's no witness protection for environmental crime. And this is, in my opinion, goes together with whistleblowing, and this is what is, in my opinion, required. I mean, it deserves a discussion just about that, and especially with the federal government, U.S. federal government. If there's any way, especially what in light of what the precious work that Dan is doing maybe there's space also for a discussion for that down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point, especially when you note that that these are trafficking that is happening alongside other very serious and organized crime. To not be able to offer that sort of protection to people coming forward with information, you can see how that would be a real hindrance to them coming forward. Now, you mentioned some things about convergence there. Tanya, I know a lot of your research has focused on crime convergence. Can you elaborate a bit more on some of the areas of convergence that you see?
Yeah, thank you. So I heartily agree with Andrea about convergence, and the evidence is mounting as to the overlaps between these. And my colleagues, Don Bonhomme, Nigel South, and I do have a recent article out that is open access talking about drugs and wildlife in particular. And it isn't just drugs in with wildlife. It could be sharing the same route, sharing the same network, sharing the same people, drugs going one way, wildlife going the other way, switching, bartering. And then Andrea also mentioned laundering, like a huge amount of money laundering is part of this convergence that we're seeing. And then I think the evidence is mounting outside of drugs as well. I think it's the human trafficking and illegal, unreported, unrecorded fishing. We see lots of human trafficking in that sphere as well. So yeah, as I said, I think we're learning more and more about this, and that's a good thing that we're knowing more, because I think it'll give more tools to law enforcement to tackle all of it together.
Great. I know you also mentioned corporate crime. Is there, what types of convergence are you seeing between wildlife trafficking and corporate crime?
So some other research colleagues and I have done are kind of criticizing the narrative that all wildlife trafficking is organized crime groups. There's certainly parts of wildlife trafficking that are done by organized crime groups. I think ivory is probably a solid example, maybe rhino horn, totoaba, or other of these. But let's not look beyond corporations and their role in this. And you're not going to have timber trafficking, the global pet trade, which is absolutely huge, of fish and reptiles and coral. And there's got to be businesses involved, right? And I think, again, we're starting to see more of what those businesses and corporations are doing. And it's this really gray area, isn't it, of the legal and the illegal blending together, and these spaces where laundering can happen. So that, I think, opens up a huge space for whistleblowing. There's employees of these businesses and companies that are going to know about the wildlife trafficking that's going on, and that's along the whole supply chain. So I think that's an area where we really need to be looking more and pushing for, as Andre said, protection for those people along the chain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I think in the US, we've recently had some interesting examples of that sort of crimes of opportunity, where there are, for some species, sort of not as much organized crime there as there is, there's a squirrel monkey trafficking ring coming out of Florida at one point, collection of native turtles, things of that nature in the US, which again can be a slightly different sort of landscape than in other geographies. But I think we certainly do see that. And so I wonder, Dan, working within the zoo and aquarium community and things, I wonder if you can contribute a bit to this sort of crimes of opportunity.
First I want to re-emphasize what both Andrea and Tanya said about convergence, and certainly in my experience in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that was the principal. Became the principal focus of investigation, and looking for this kind of evidence of organized crime and specific dedicated criminal network, and so that's extraordinarily important. And from the standpoint of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, our members rely on sustainable trade in live animals and animal parts. And so, we talk about the magnitude of illegal trade. Well, the magnitude of legal trade in wildlife and both live animals and animal parts is probably orders of magnitude higher. And so it's important as an element of business to have sustainable, ethical, reliable regulation of trade, and so people can continue to conduct business. And it's key in certainly in our industry to have reliable, sustainable trade, and that's why we're certainly an interested party in this regard. It's obviously important from a standpoint of biodiversity conservation, because wildlife trafficking is a major source of decline in biodiversity. It's important from the standpoint of human health, because as we've seen recently with pandemics, possibly with COVID-19 pandemic, it's our relationship with animals and trade in animals that is creating risk for new emergence of new diseases in humans. And so addressing this issue effectively is extraordinarily important. And you asked about the crimes of convenience. We certainly have seen that within our industry. We had a keeper at Oklahoma City Zoo who was trafficking in Galapagos tortoise eggs. And so, as soon as that was discovered, our member, Oklahoma City Zoo, worked hand in glove with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to support that enforcement and prosecution. So you have individuals who are, that keeper was not part of an organized syndicate, a criminal syndicate. It was clearly just an opportunistic endeavor on his part. He had access to the product, tortoise eggs, and had the ability to take advantage of that access to engage in criminal conduct. And so that certainly multiplied across on a global scale is a significant enterprise in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. So it sounds like there are then, safe to say that there are an array of criminal types that are involved in this type of activity, and then a diversity of people that may be exposed or have information. And so we've touched a little bit on the challenges of getting whistleblowers to come forward. What is the biggest challenge? I've heard the protections aspect there. Perhaps they're not given enough protections, but in the example of perhaps someone who's just seeing a crime of opportunity, maybe they just don't. What is the number one challenge you would say in really engaging whistleblowers more substantially in combating wildlife trafficking? Whoever wants to jump in on that.
I'll speak from the standpoint of, again, a former administrator. I think what's important is the ability to provide protections. Because as Andrea mentioned before, if you can't protect whistleblowers, then they won't come forward. And so, certainly I think it's important from the standpoint of thinking about US domestic law. I would say it's important for enforcement agencies to have a common, well understood, well-financed system to protect whistleblowers and to reward whistleblowers. Because some of them, especially as we're thinking about corporate crime, they're taking a substantial risk with their livelihood. So it's important to be able to protect them. It's important to be able to reward them. Those mechanisms need to be commonly understood and commonly applied across federal, state, and local governments.
Yeah, and I also think that in order to put together the right framework that will allow us to enjoy, to use, to better use potential whistleblowing, it's important to define who is a whistleblower in environmental crime. It's not white collar whistleblowing. It's very different. White collar whistleblowing is someone who is working, operating in a legal environment, in a legal, in a company, for example, and he sees or she sees something wrong, something illegal. Whistleblowing, when you talk about environmental crime, wildlife crime, the illegal supply chain, pretty much the whole supply chain is illegal. So these are people operating, working, living in a very different context than a white collar whistleblower. Plus, some of them might not be incentivized to talk because they're actually making good money already. And if you look at the supply chain and you start from the very beginning, where, from the poacher or from the illegal fisherman, they don't make so much money, but still they do well in what they're doing. But often they don't know much. So this is one kind of whistleblower that might help you to be more effective on the ground. And then you go up the supply chain, and maybe you get into a middleman. So the middleman is already an interesting person. We, as an organization, we focus a lot on middlemen because they are right in the middle. They know a bit about poaching, they know a bit about trafficking, they know a lot of things. But they're also making good money. So how can you, so maybe he's also not the right whistleblower for us, right? Then you go up the supply chain and you get into serious trafficking, serious traffickers, they do millions of dollars. So I think it's very unlikely to get a whistleblower from those kind of people. Where is the opportunity? The opportunity is in all the people around these people. So not just friends and family members, but also people working in the government, people working in airport and seaports and shipping companies. As WideLeaks, we receive, at least in a couple of occasions, really good information from people who we think they were working in a shipping company. So it's also important to understand who are the wildlife crime whistleblowers, where are they, and what is their value, and how we can help them making the first step. And as Dan and Tanya said, protection and remuneration are two key aspects of the whole thing, but also trust. You have to inspire trust. Otherwise, they will not even approach you. So it's a delicate work that you have to do around whistleblowing.
I just wanted to follow up. I think that you probably do have cases where wildlife trafficking whistleblowing might be like white collar. If you're in a timber company and you see something happening illegal, maybe you're just an employee and you might report it. So I think we might see some overlap there, though I totally take your point, Andrea, that there's illegal supply chains that are not equivalent or similar. But I just like to say, maybe people don't know where to whistleblow or that they can whistleblow. And so I think that that's probably your first big hurdle. And something like WideLeaks is essential for that, of giving people a place to go, because I imagine they don't know that that's available to them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that being able to assure them of the protection, the remuneration, the anonymity, all of that. But that does jump past to assume that they know that they even have important information. They know that they've seen something illegal. They know where to report that. And so where can whistleblowers report this? Is it WideLeaks? Is it local authorities? Where, if I were had information, from a friend who was collecting native turtles, where should I go with that information?
Well, we get a lot of this kind of information through WideLeaks. My friend has, I remember a submission, like my neighbor has 50, 60 snakes in his house, and I think you should look into that. We get this kind of stuff as well, of course. And we get also a lot of things that we cannot check. I always said that we created WideLeaks to get, it's like, in order to get diamonds, you have to go through the dirt. There's no other way around. So you also have to receive a lot of things that are not really relevant, but that's part of the job. But WideLeaks is a place, of course. One reason why years ago we partnered with the National Whistleblowing Center in Washington is because we really needed, we really felt that we are maybe in the position to capture the information either through WideLeaks or through our presence in the field, because we deal with a lot of sources. But then we would need a reliable partner, for example, back in the US to act as a sort of a buffer between us, the whistleblower, and the US government. and to see if there is a reward and everything. So that's why it's not just one company work. We should all team up to create the perfect conditions to attract or to facilitate the first step from a whistleblower. Rightfully said, like by Tanya, she is totally right. We can have sort of white collar whistleblowing in timber, also illegal fishing. But then once we get the information, what do we do? Assuming it's a good information, where do we go? And so we have to have a structure also for that. And that's why we partner with the National Whistleblowing Center, because they can do that part of the job. They can relate with the US government and find the right law that can be applied and have a serious discussion about possible rewards.
I'll just add a dimension of complexity there, again, from my previous experience, and talking to law enforcement professionals. I do think we have to figure that part out. How do we create an effective network where people can report without becoming an interference with law enforcement? Because a lot of times law enforcement professionals are like, we're already working with these people, and now I've got multiple people coming into me, basically telling me I need to talk to the same source, that, oh, well, we have this tip, we have this tip, we have this tip. And it jeopardizes the security of the law enforcement and the relationship, the trust that Andrea mentioned with that source. And so I do think that the question you asked, Danielle, is a critical question to resolve. How do we advertise and recruit this information without causing conflict with ongoing law enforcement investigations? So.
Yeah, really great point. And unfortunately, we are short on time, but I do sort of want to wrap up with one question. So wildlife trade has really even more so come in sort of the mainstream in recent months due to the COVID-19 pandemic, possible origins of where that came from. And again, up there, we're talking about legal and also illegal trades. Those of us who have been working in this space, as I know you all have, certainly weren't caught off guard by the COVID-19 pandemic, because we knew it was one of those, it was a pandemic, it was going to come at some point. And also illegal wildlife trade is not something, it's not a new and emerging issue. This is something that governments, that NGOs, that folks have been working on for decades. And frankly, we haven't solved it yet, we haven't succeeded. What is, if you could target it down to the one thing, what is the one thing that maybe we need to be talking about more than what we are? Species, product, trafficking route. What's one thing that we need to be talking about more? And the second part of that question is what is the one thing that we need to be doing to solve this crisis more?
I guess I would say we need to be building more of a global consensus and focus on this, and that's why AZA has joined in supporting the End Wildlife Crime Initiative, because I think developing global consensus around things like the fifth protocol to the UN the Treaty on Organized Crime, and converting CITES into a One Health framework that looks at both species and human health. I think that will help build global consensus around this and identify the mechanisms through which we can much more aggressively enforce and prosecute wildlife crime.
Yeah, I like to echo what Dan said. Global consensus is fundamental, like a global reform of all those different entities and bodies working is super important. From an operational point of view, and this would probably help global consensus as well, we have to finally, we're talking about the fourth largest criminal enterprise in the world, environmental crime. In some countries is even higher, it's number 3, number 2, number 1. So it's time to approach this problem in the way we are approaching other global threats like narco trafficking, like organized crime, like terrorism. where we use completely different mindset, technologies, people, methodologies, laws. So it's completely different over there. And yet, when we try to confront the 4 largest criminal enterprises in the world, we're almost Boy Scouts, let's face it. I mean, the bad guys are constantly ahead of us, constantly. They've been ahead of us for 20, 30, 40 years. And so, you know, I'm just saying, I don't have the magic wand, but I'm saying that it's time to collectively acknowledge what we have not done right, and try to come up with different, stronger, more proactive actions. And of course, I keep saying, I repeat it all the times, I also would like to see a better, more you know, a better, more genuine collaborations among NGOs and all the stakeholders. Sometimes the collaboration is just a couple of logos on a report, and I'd like to see something different sooner or later.
I'd echo again, Andrea and Dan. I think the UNTAC protocol around adding wildlife trafficking along with arms and humans and smuggling is the next best short-term thing to do. And I think that protocol is particularly powerful because it takes that approach that the Lacey Act in the US takes, or let's not forget Canada has the same approach, where something that's illegal in the source country is going to also be illegal in the country where it's discovered. And that's really powerful tool for law enforcement and for tackling this. So I do think that that protocol is something I would really like to see happen. And it's also bigger than CITES. CITES, you know, it's done a solid job for 45, 46 years, but it's only 38,000 species, and we're talking millions of species in trade here. So the protocol is much more powerful than anything we currently have. And on a different level, I'd like to see animal welfare more ingrained to all of this trade discussion. If we are going to prevent the next pandemic, wildlife welfare, animal welfare is human welfare, and it's got to be less stressful, more hygienic, less abusive for all of the wildlife that are involved in this. And I think that would make a huge difference as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. It takes us back to why we should all care about this, right? There are so many aspects, be it whether you care about the crime and the money laundering side of it, the animal welfare side, the public health side, lots of different aspects about that the trade folks they care about. Well, I'm glad to hear that we have consensus among the 3 of you that we need global consensus on how to address this. So it seems like we are on our way. I just want to thank you all for a really great discussion today. We could go on, I think, for hours and really, you know, hammer out some details on how to make all this happen. I hope that, you know, in future whistleblower days that we are talking about all of the really great information that's been brought forward, the investigations and the prosecutions, and everything that has been able to happen because of the robust protections offered to whistleblowers and their engagement in this. So fingers crossed, we have a ways to go.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Tanya, Andrea.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
You.